We're going to be exploring the different data types that you can use within your JavaScript code. So previously we had explored strings. We're going to be looking at numbers. We'll also be looking at Boolean values, and of course arrays and objects. Arrays and objects allow us to have multiple values assigned to one variable, and then we can select those values, we can manipulate those values, and I'm going to be showing you some examples of which ones we can use and how we can use those in this lesson. So let's get started coding some JavaScript. Let's create a brand new JS file. So I've called it app2.js, and we're going to update the HTML source. We're not going to actually update the HTML file contents, just the source to the JavaScript. And so this is one of the advantages of having separate script files that you can update and edit them, and you just need to update the HTML that's going to be linking to that new script file. So now when I refresh the HTML page, none of the JavaScript from app1 is running anymore since we're only linking to app2.js. So JavaScript code is a set of instructions that we're supplying to the browser in order to let them know what we want to happen. So one of the ways that we can do this is we type in some variables, which we saw last time, and then use those variables and update them throughout our code. So I'm going to show you a different data type. Last time we looked at just strings. There are different data types such as numbers. So a number is represented without any quotes around it. And this will output the same way as we saw before, where we can reference the variable name to output the value. And there is a difference between num and if we do a string value, or let's call this num1, and we'll do quotes around the value of 100, and we'll output both of them into the console so that you can see that there is a difference in the way that the console displays it. For numbers, they are represented in blue within the browser, and for strings, they're going to be represented in black. For numbers, we can also have different operators where we can add to a number. So if we take the value of num and we'll equal it to the value of num plus 100, and if we take num1 and we equal it to the value of num1, and we're going to add 100 to that one as well. Let's see what the difference in the results is. So refresh the page, and we see that the first value where we're adding 100, even though this is a number as well as this is a number, it was treated very differently. Where the first values took the 100 and did a math operation where it added another 100 to it, resulting in the value of num at this current time when we're referencing it within the browser to be a value of 200, whereas num1 started out as a string, we added 100 to a string, so it kept it as a string, and it just added in to the string the number of characters, so it added the 100 in characters to that string. So that turns out to be the value of num1 and num. So there is a difference. JavaScript does have a way that it can switch data types. You can always reference and pull the data type out by selecting the method called typeOf and then wrapping the variable that you want to get the type of within the rounded parentheses. So let's output both of these types and we'll refresh it, and we see that the first one is a number type, whereas the second one is going to be a type of string. You can convert a number into a string. So if we were to add to the number and we were to add a string value to the number, the result would be that it's a string. If we want to return back the value of num, we're going to see that it's actually the value of same as num1 because we're adding a string to a number. So JavaScript automatically converts the data type to a string and it doesn't keep it as a number. But if we have the value of the string first, and then we're adding it to a number, and we refresh it, they're still going to both be strings, and we're actually not going to be able to tell the difference because we're adding it before that. So if it is a string, and if you're trying to add a string to a number, JavaScript is going to convert it into a data type of num. There's also Boolean data types. And these can be either true or false, and they're perfect with logical statements. So let's output the value of boo, which is just a Boolean value of true. This as well is going to be represented in blue, just like the numbers. And if we select the type of for boo, it's going to return back that this is a Boolean type. There's also undefined. So when a variable is declared, but we don't have a value assigned to it, so we just declared the value of num2, let's see what it gets returned back as type of. And if we haven't declared anything, the type is going to be undefined, as well as the value of num2 is also going to be undefined. So undefined means that the variable has been declared, but we haven't assigned a value to it. There's also data types where we can assign null to it. So null just means that there is no value assigned. So it is slightly different than undefined, and the data type is going to come back as an object instead of undefined. So we've assigned a value of null, and that means that there's no value that's been assigned to it, and it's going to return back as an object. There's also data types that can hold multiple different values, and these are as well can be defined as objects. So take a look at one of the first ones is going to be an array. So that's declared and defined with the brackets. So if we console log the value of r and we console log the type of for the array, let's see what we get within the console. So we get this type of output where we can open it up, and it has some properties that it contains within it, including the length. So arrays will always come with a length, and we see that the length of this particular array is 0, as we don't have any values that are contained within the array. It's also an object data type, and that means that we can change the contents of the object without having to redeclare the variable. So if you are using arrays, then you can use the const, and I'll show you how you can update the contents of it as well. Within the array, you can hold as much different values, and these are index based, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So we can have string values within the arrays, we can have numbers, we can have more strings, we can have booleans, and we can also contain arrays within our arrays. So I just have in some numbers within there. And let's save that. I'm also going to update the view to the word wrap so that we can see the entire statement from the code within the left-hand side of the browser. And I'll comment out some of the previous console messages as we want to focus on the arrays. So when we output the array within the console, we get all of the values of the array, and they're assigned to an index value. The index value starts at 0, and this is also how we can return back the values and reassign the values that are contained within the array. So starting at 0, and we have the word hello, and we have the two numbers, we have another string 4, Boolean, and then we've got an array that's contained within the array, and we can open that up as well. That one also has the property for length. Notice the parent has a property of length of 6 because it's got 6 items contained within the array, and because they're 0 based, they're going to start with 0. So if you have 6 items, to get the 6th item, you're going to have to use the index value of 5 in order to return back that value. An array as well is returning back as an object type of data type of object. I comment that one out as well. And in order to retrieve back the contents of an array, we just need to specify the index value that we want to retrieve back. So for index value of 2, that's going to return back the 3rd item within the array, which has a value of 2. If we want to return back the 4th item within the array, we're going to use an index value of 3, and that's going to return back the string value of 4. Let's assign some new values to the contents of the array. So we can set the array and select it by the index value. So for index value of 1, so current value of index value of 1 is 1. Let's update this to be 1, a string value of 1, and save that, and we'll refresh it. And now when we look at our array, when we're listing it out, that second value has changed from the numeric value of 1 to the word string value of 1. So we've been able to make an update to it by reassigning the value of it. Even though note that it is const, we're able to reassign the value using the index. And the reason is that arrays store this information in a memory location. So this variable is actually referencing a memory location. And that's why if we set up a second array and we assign it to the first array, we output the contents of the second array and save it, we see the values of the first array, but what happens when we try to output the values of the second array again after we've assigned a new value to it? We're going to see that those arrays are still holding the same values. So even though that we changed the one array value, they're going to be reflected in both, because once again, it's referencing this data in a particular location in memory, and we've assigned the value of array 1 to be equal to what the array is. So they're both referencing that same location. So now when we change the value of 1, it's going to also get reflected in the value of the other. So that's one of the things to watch out for when you are working with arrays and you assign one array to the other. It means that they're still going to be connected and they're still going to be referencing that same set of data that we originally pointed to within the first array. There's another data type that can contain multiple values, and that's going to be an object. And for objects, just as arrays, you can use const. Objects are represented by curly brackets, and then the content contained within the object are name pair values. So in order to reference the value, we need a property name and then a value that's going to be associated with that property name. So you can only have one property name, so they do have to be unique, and it will let you write other property names, but that will overwrite the first reference of the property. Let's output the object into the console. So we can take a closer look at the object in the console, and notice that we set the property name for first to Laurence, but then we overwrote first with Larry, and that's why when we output the result into the console, we got the first for Larry and the last for Svekis. So you can overwrite the contents of the object by referencing the property name. So they're all unique, and there's no particular order as we saw within the array for the property names. You can also use within, similar to a JSON format, where you can use the double quotes in order to set a property name, and they do need to be comma separated or you're going to throw an error. The end result is going to be that whether we're single quoting or double quoting, we can set the property names. If you are writing JSON data, then you do need to use the double quotes in order to be proper JSON data formatted. You can have different data types, such as the ID. So this is a number data type. And in order to reference the contents of the object, you use the property name that you've set the value to. So let's update the myObjectFull, where we select it, and there's two ways to select the object property. You can use the dot or the bracket notation. If you're using the dot, then you have to make sure that the property names are going to be consistent within the object format, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later on. ls as the string value for full, and it's just called ls. So we've updated the value of full. If we have full name, where within the bracketed property name we can use spacing, we can no longer reference it with the dot notation, as it's going to throw an error that it doesn't understand what this value property is. This is where we can use the bracket notation in order to set the property name. So this way you can use the property names and they can contain spaces. Or if you're not using the quotes, then you can stay to the same rules that you have for setting variable names, setting the property names in the object. Now typically if you are just using a JavaScript object, then I do suggest to just stay to simple naming convention where you're not using any spaces and you're not having to use the double quotes. And that way you can always use the dot notation in order to reference the values. There's one other thing to note as well, that with the dot notation, if we had property names that were going to be dynamic, that we were going to be incrementing, we would have to once again use the bracket notation in order to return back those values. So for instance, if we were outputting the value of my object and we want to output the value of ID, so either 01 or 02, we can reference that. So let's try that, where we're going to set a variable name of, it's going to be a string value of ID 0, and we can use the variable in order to reference the property name and output it. And then if we were to take that property and update it to 01, we could once again output the property name into the console using the variable. So let's try that, where we're outputting the value of 1 and 2, and we've updated that property name. And in that case, we are using the bracket notation in order to output those values. So we've covered quite a bit in this lesson, covering the different data types. And prior to the next lesson, moving on to the next lesson, create an object, add in some property names, make some updates to it, retrieve it back using the bracket notation, as well as the dot notation, and output it into the console, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.